Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I think we'll get underway. Thank you all for attending today's webinar. My name is Lanny McGinnis. I'm President and CEO of the Manitoba Home Builders Association, and welcome to the first MHBA virtual technical session of 2022. Just before we get underway, some minor housekeeping notes before we begin. If you have any questions during today's presentation, please type your questions into the chat box by clicking the chat icon at the bottom of your screen. Austin, who's facilitating today's session, will be monitoring the chat for your questions. We'll raise them as soon as they come in, so that while Darrell's on a topic, we can ask that question on your behalf. But there will also be plenty of time for your questions and your comments at the end of the presentation. So please make sure that if you do have a question, you enter it into the chat. Today's session is being recorded and will be made available to everyone who has registered. So if there's something you'd like to take a closer look at, the video for the presentation will be made available to everyone. And so with that, let's kick off today's session, and it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Darrell Paul has been involved in wood frame construction for the past 42 years. During his first 20 years, he worked as a framing carpenter, then moved into site supervision, where he also completed the PHBI Master Builder, Master Renovator designations. In the late 1990s, he got involved with building science, providing technical support for Delta MS foundation wraps, and then in the moisture control technician course through SAIT, which he taught for 14 years. In 2019, his company Qualistat merged with a mechanical engineering company, where today they have offices in Calgary and Edmonton and provide energy code compliance for NECB and 9.36, as well as building envelope and mechanical engineering design and diagnostic assessments. Darrell is a published author, and recently the book Building Envelope Tie-in Details, written for the Siding Association of Alberta, was just released. Darrell presented at our 2021 Housing Forum, and we're very happy to have him back virtually presenting for you today. So Darrell, thank you so much for being our speaker today, and I'll turn things over to you.
Thanks, Lanny. Nice to see everybody again. Today's topic on attic rain is one that we've been talking about here in Alberta for a number of years, probably about 15 years now. It goes back to probably middle 2005, 2006, when we started to see this happen. It's not something that I remember during my career 10 years as a site supervisor, so it's relatively new. So then the question comes up, what's the cause of it? Well, just to define attic rain, first of all, attic rain is excessive frost accumulations, and then when it warms up, that frost melts and rapidly just drips into the ceiling, into walls. It can happen in the attic, it can happen into your walls, it can happen on foundations. So it can happen in a number of locations. So as we go through today, we're going to try and assess what the issue is, what's causing it, what's the solution. And it's relatively simple from the standpoint of it's frost that's accumulating because air is leaking into the attic. So we're going to break it down and make it a little more informative for you than that. But here in this picture, you can see that, you know, on the left, you can see the frost accumulation. And a lot of people, they say, well, you know, there's not enough ventilation, but it's really nothing to do with ventilation, because look at the bottom of this attic where the insulation stops are. There's tons of ventilation in this attic, and yet look at the accumulation of frost there. Over on the right is the infrared view after everything starts to melt and the water drips through the insulation, and now it's laying on the poly just above the drywall. So you're seeing these wet areas occur. With regard to just crawling up in an attic, what you're going to find when you get in there is you're going to see, you know, moisture. You can see all the moisture dripping out of that insulation there. And you can get a tremendous amount of water accumulation up there. So that's one of the things that is really challenging. So there's a note here. Don't see any pictures. Just making sure everybody can see this okay. All right, so this is the outcome. So you can see the stain along the ceiling there. You can see the staining you know, up here in this location here, you can see the red on the fan, the exhaust fan grill. That's from the tape, the color coming out of the tape. So you're getting very strong and high amounts of saturation and moisture sitting up in those locations. Before we get into too much about this, I think the first thing we need to understand is the responsibility for compliance when it comes to the building code and construction. So when it comes to the code, this is an important factor. It doesn't matter how many inspections are done by the municipality, by the AHJ. You as the builder, you as the trade installing that item, you as the supplier of the item or the designer are all equally responsible to meet the building code. So you can't say, well, it's not my fault because I didn't do that. You know, it's not my fault because the inspector looked at it. The safety codes officer was out, signed off on the building. So that's an important aspect of this, because we get a lot of people that tend to want to shift the blame into other areas. Now, one of the key things we started to see when this all started was staining on cladding. So here we're seeing in the spring, or every time it warms up significantly, we see a lot of walls that stain as well as attics that stain. So we call it attic rain, but I associate it with anything to do with the exterior perimeter of the building, because it's an excessive accumulation of frost, which melts rapidly and then runs out. And the staining that you're seeing is actually the resins or the tannins out of the OSB. And that's building up and then running out through the cladding, and that's what's leaving the stain. So when you look at, when you look at a wall and you see these kind of stains, particularly on lap siding or vinyl siding, this is an indication that you have something going on where the air from the building is making its way into the wall, it's accumulating, and it's an excessive amount, because you're always going to have frost. You always have frost in your attic, you'll always have frost in the walls. There's nothing you can do about that, but it shouldn't be large amounts. And when it warms up, it should sublimate and just go back into the air. So when you look at a roof like this, we see this a lot, where people start to put massive amounts of venting on the roof. And this is not the solution for attic rain. Ventilation will take care of condensation, which is the liquid, but it won't take care of frost, because if the air leaves the building, on its way up, it finds a cold surface, it deposits the frost, and it's actually called deposition. So it deposits the frost, leaves it inside, and then the air continues out the vent. So on the way out, it's already dumped the moisture in the form of frost, and that continues to accumulate and build and build and build, even though the air is leaving the building. So that's why it's not a ventilation issue. I had a laugh about this one. You know, if you see frost, hoarfrost on trees, does that mean your neighbor doesn't have enough ventilation in his backyard? So it's the same principle. It's hoarfrost that's building up, but it's accumulating to a huge amount, and then all of a sudden it melts. So it's not a lack of ventilation that's creating this. It's an excess amount of humidity in conjunction with the amount of moisture that's up there. And this is proven true, because if you look at CMHC, here's one they wrote. They said, attic ventilation is overrated. In winter, cold air cannot hold much humidity or carry moisture away from the attic. In summer, attic temperatures are more affected by sun and shingle color than by ventilation. So research shows identical attics, one vented, the other vented to code, one unvented, the other vented to code, have much the same humidity and temperature. So that's the truth behind it, is that the venting anymore doesn't make a huge difference. Why? Because of the energy. So the title of it was Attic Rain, the Curse of Energy Efficiency. So what do you need to dry something out or prevent frost from forming? You need heat. What do you need to get rid of the moisture that accumulates? You need air. So you need heat and air. So when we make a house more airtight and we put more insulation into it, the insulation prevents radiant heat from reaching up into the top surfaces, keeping it warm, where it'll reduce that accumulation of frost. So it's got to do with dealing with the amount of energy that's being lost into the attic, which offsets. So older houses, lots of energy lost into the attic, didn't have attic rain. Newer houses, almost no energy loss into the attic. There's the big difference. All right, so what are the conditions for attic rain? So if we're talking about the conditions for attic rain, the conditions have to do with these three items. If we look at moisture, opening, and a pressure. So I call it the Mop Principle. So if you have this Mop Principle, or moisture, opening, and a pressure, you have certain amounts of each of those items which can create the problem. So if you look on the left, you have an equal amount of moisture through an equal size opening and equal amount of pressure. So when we look at that, that tells us that, a combination of three things are causing the problem. When we look at the middle one here, we're finding that here we have a lot of pressure. That's the main driving force behind the air moving into the attic. And then the third one here, maybe we don't have a lot of pressure and not a lot of moisture, but we have a huge amount of openings or penetrations. So maybe you've got 30, 40 pot lights in the ceiling and they're not well sealed. So there's a combination of things that it takes. It's not just the homeowners putting too much humidity in the house. It's not just too many holes and not just too much pressure. It's a combination of all three. So this effect, or this attic rain, can happen in super airtight houses as well. So it's a little more rare, but it can happen. So moisture is the first one we'll talk about. So let's look at moisture in more detail. So how does moisture get into an attic? Well, maybe it's a poor design, right? That's pretty obvious. But maybe in the case like this, maybe the homeowner is producing way too much moisture versus how much they're ventilating. So if they're not getting rid of the accumulation of moisture in the building, it just builds up. And now all that moisture, humidity that's in the air, you can see there, they had, 63% moisture, middle of winter. You can see all the growths occurring all along the windows and mold growth up in the corner. So that contributes a lot. So even if you have a well-built home, not a lot of pressure, fairly airtight, this is going to be a killer. So you first have to identify, is it a construction flaw or is it just being operated at a level that exceeds what the code design is? So for the building code, if you look in the appendix of 9.27 or 9.25, you're going to see that it'll mention the term 35% or 750 pascals of vapor pressure. So as a rule, 35% is the maximum. Now, if you're into -30, -35, -40, I would strongly recommend you go far lower than that. That should probably be closer to 30% relative humidity, or even 25%. But as a rule, our designs for construction across Canada are maximum winter 35%. So in that case here, we've got a high level of moisture, which is contributing to the problem, probably higher than what this is showing. But that's what's creating the issue in this particular case, excessive amounts of moisture, which are going into the attic. So telltale signs would be things like this. You walk into the house and you see these excessive amounts of moisture, right? So during cold weather, you're going to get frost in those door handles. You're going to get frost around the doors. And then when it warms up, it's going to melt and come back in. And you see the damage that this creates. So there's way too much humidity. And, you can see the damage it's creating even on the interior trims. So you can imagine if the interior looks like that, if air leaks into the wall, what does the interior of the wall, or what does the attic look like? So that's why it's so important to have a homeowner control the amount of humidity in the building. So the amount of humidity in the building, maxing at 35%. If they're exceeding that, then my question is, well, why do you go in and do warranty work on there until they prove that they've got that under control? And sometimes it's the fact that, they don't turn the fans on, but other times, and we find this a lot, is there's a fan in the bathroom, there's an HRV in the house, there's an exhaust fan, but when you actually test the flow of the exhaust fan, it's way lower than what it's supposed to be. So in the local area here, we always have these stickers, which indicate the balancing of the exhaust system, the ventilation system. And a lot of times you see the sticker, it's written in there, you know, the intake is 65 and the exhaust is 65. And they've got it written exactly in those two numbers. Well, there's no way you can balance the system that perfectly. So if you're not balancing the system, then you're pressurizing and pushing air out. But at the same time, sometimes the ventilation is inadequate. So they measure it and they say it's 65, but when we measure it, we find it's about 25 or 30. Because instead of going by an actual measurement, they're using the calculation based on the duct size to determine the flow. So you go up in the bathroom, you put an anemometer on it, and you measure it, and they're at 25 CFM. And they're saying, well, we're running our switches, we're running the fans, we're turning things on, but we can't get rid of the humidity. So those are things that have to be addressed first. So don't just assume that they're not running it. You need to test and make sure that it's working properly. And then you can determine whether it's customer error or not. So as we're talking about moisture here, let's look at the building science behind moisture. So if we look at the difference between evaporation and condensation, right? The energy that it takes to remove energy or add energy. So if you have water laying outside in the summertime and the sun shines on it, it evaporates. And then when the temperature drops, that water will condense back on cooler surfaces. And that's what happens to moisture when it's above freezing. But below freezing, and something the building code does not address at all in colder climates, is the fact that we have what's called sublimation and deposition. So in other words, below the freezing temperature, when air reaches a cold surface, it turns to a hoarfrost. We call that deposition, but it doesn't always have to melt. So it can go straight from a vapor to a solid, which is the frost, and conversely, straight from a frost back to a vapor. It can evaporate. So over a long period of time in the wintertime, if you don't get fresh snow, your snow will disappear due to sublimation. It'll disappear. Even though it hasn't been warm enough to melt, it'll go away. So the same thing happens on a typical house. If you have frost in the attic, you have a little small amount, or frost in the walls, frost in the concrete, that's normal. But it shouldn't be excessive. But it'll evaporate or it'll sublimate depending on the temperature. So that's what we call a phase change. The other thing we have to understand about the moisture in a building is the relative humidity. So if you look at this chart here to illustrate it, if you look on the left, that balloon is 100% saturated air. It's 5 degrees, it's fully saturated air. If you put any more moisture into that air, any more water vapor into that air, it's going to condense because the air can't hold any more moisture. But what happens when you warm the air up? Once you warm the air up, it expands. And now it can hold more water vapor, but the percentage of it drops. So if you look at the middle, you're going to see that the middle balloon is the same amount of moisture. So there's the absolute, or what we call absolute humidity. So you've got 5.4 grams per kilogram of air. So in all three examples, same amount of water vapor in the air, but at 5 degrees, it's maxed out, it's saturating. Once you warm it to 21 degrees, it's only covering 35% of the volume. And then once you warm it up to 30 degrees again, it's down to 20% of the volume. So air that's warmed, the relative humidity goes down as the temperature goes up. So it's converse. So it goes the opposite. So if you have a homeowner and they have sweaty windows in the house, or they have condensation forming on a surface, you need the warm air from the middle of the room to reach that surface to absorb all of that moisture. Because the air that's in the corner, just stale sitting there, is going to reach saturation point, and then condensation occurs on the surface. Well, the same thing happens in an attic, except it's deposition, it's frost forming. So the air doesn't go up, go through the attic and leave. It goes up, and as it's going past something cold, it dumps all the frost on there. And then the air leaves through the ventilation. So that's why ventilation in an attic won't help you to eliminate until everything melts. So there's the difference. right? If I take air that's at 35%, 21 degrees C, it's at 5.4 grams per kilogram. But if I have air outside that's minus 25 degrees and it's fully saturated, the air is shrunk right down. It's 100% humid in that air. It only has 0.4 grams per kilogram of actual moisture in the air. So the colder it is outside, the more effective your ventilation system will operate. So if you're getting close to the same temperatures, but it's really humid outside and you're trying to remove humidity, the colder the temperature, the quicker you can do that. So your HRV only has to run 1/10 of the time at minus 35 as it does at -5 or -10. So that's the benefit of the cold air. It's super dry. It doesn't hold on to a lot of moisture. So how much moisture does it hold? You know, what are we talking about here? Well, if we were to look at an attic space, and an average attic space for a 1,200 square foot bungalow is about 4,000 cubic feet if you got a 412 roof. So you get 4,000 cubic feet of air, height, width by length. And the amount of moisture in that air at 21 degrees is about 2 liters of condensable moisture. Once you cool that down to 0, it'll only hold 600 millimeters. And once you get it down to minus 30, it can't hold anything. So if you overnight went from 21 degrees down to the minus 30, that air can't hold anything. So how much air from your house leaking into your minus 30 attic, how much moisture or frost is going to accumulate in that attic? Especially if there's a small pressure, a small opening, plus the moisture. Remember that Mop principle, moisture, opening, and a pressure. So very important to understand the principles behind it. So this is the moisture portion of it. Now, if we go dive a little bit deeper, evaporation, notice here, requires energy, things to evaporate, I need energy. Condensation requires energy. But one moves into it and one moves out of it. So for things to evaporate, I need the energy. And then when evaporation occurs, it cools off surfaces around it. When condensation forms, I'm actually warming surfaces around it. So it's the opposite transfer of moisture. And this is an interesting one. 1,000 BTUs to evaporate 1 pound of water. So what's the purpose of energy efficiency? Well, it's to reduce the energy loss or the heat loss. So if I have energy being lost into the attic, the energy to keep the frost or the condensation from occurring in the attic, right there, I just lost it when I increased the insulation value of my attic. If I go to R60 insulation, I don't have the heat loss. So without the energy, I don't have evaporation and I don't have sublimation. So I need to pay for that somehow. I need the energy somehow. So if I compare a new house to an old house, and I think, okay, so in this old house, I have R20 insulation. Let's say I have a relatively airtight ceiling, but all I have is R20 insulation. In the newer house, I have a relatively airtight, but I have R60 insulation. Well, I still have radiant heat loss. So what's the temperature up here on these cold surfaces? Well, if I have a temperature up, whoops, let me just back that up a second here. If I have a temperature up there that's cold, because of the R60, I don't have the energy loss. I don't have any energy up in here. So all of the cords and all of the bottom of the sheathing is going to have these big icicles hanging off them. Whereas over here, this is nice and warm. And if it's too warm, I create a problem with ice damming. But if it's just that right temperature, I don't have the ice damming, and I also don't have the condensation or the frost accumulation in the attic. So, you know, houses built in the 1960s, 1980s, 2000, 2010, very little risk of attic rain compared to in 2010 and onward up to today. And that's a lot to do with the energy efficiency that we put in. So that's part of the issue that we run into. So the unintended consequence of this, the unintended consequence of having no heat loss into the attic is we have colder attics and higher risk of frost. Same thing happens in your basement wall. If you build a concrete wall, 2x6 wall in front of it with R20 insulation, you know, when you had no insulation, that concrete was cold, but it didn't get frost on it because the air could transport around it and get rid of that moisture. But now that concrete's cold, or that sheathing above grade is cold. If you're putting R22 or R24 baths within that, then the air that leaks in there creates more problems. So as we move forward towards 2030, when we're getting into mandatory net zero ready construction, where we have high insulation values, this is going to become more and more and more of an issue. So that's why it's important to learn this now, to understand this now. So let's keep going here. We talked about this quickly. We'll talk about it again though, but sublimation, where energy is used to remove the moisture from a solid state and move it back to a vapor state, that's what we call sublimation. Each one of these requires energy. One, we add energy, one, we remove energy. So it's the same principle. The only difference here is this one, we do it without passing through the liquid phase. So I think that's where the confusion comes in, is we look at frost and we go, oh, that means we need ventilation, but that's not true. Because we can go to frost, or we can go back to vapor, and back to frost and back to vapor, and we never have to hit the liquid. And it's the liquid that does the damage to our buildings. All right, so let's look at an attic here. When we look at the principle here, the same principle, and we go, here's an attic, here's the frost in the attic, and that's not an unusual amount of frost. But why is this area here all nice and clean? What's the difference? Well, where the air is actually flowing and moving, because of the movement of the air, it's actually absorbing the moisture in that location. So you can imagine if you were using this as your principle behind ventilation, you would need to ventilate to be effective like this. The other problem with ventilation is that if you create a suction, this goes back to the pressure side of this conversation, if the air is blowing over the top of the roof and it's pulling out more air than the soffits are feeding, you're going to be pulling air from the house into the attic as well. So we'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit here, but here's the principle behind this. Your cold surfaces are going to condense because the air is not moving over those surfaces. It's the same reason you get frost on your windows on the inside of the house, and you get condensation on the windows on the inside of the house. You've turned the mechanical system off and there's no air movement. So where the air is moving, you don't get this occurrence as much as you do where the air is not moving, where it's stale. So what's the cost of repair versus the cost of doing it right? We need to understand the impact of energy efficiency and managing moisture to be able to handle this. So, you know, the cost of repair, well, what do we need to do? Well, if we have a problem, we need to either eliminate the moisture, we need to eliminate or reduce the openings, and we need to eliminate or get rid of the pressures. So one of those three is what's creating the problem. So that's where we get into the details of this. So when we look at the building itself, here's some fallacies that we could rely on, because tape seals poly. Well, that's partly true. If you look at the picture here, you see everywhere it's nice and tight, it's a dark color down here, and everywhere it's not, the air is just flowing right through that whole thing. So first of all, when you put the tape on, do you make sure it's compressed and pushed in nice and tight, or do you just lay it on, push the tape at the two ends, and we're good enough, right? The other one is acoustical seals poly. So which one's better, acoustical or caulking or the tape? Well, both are equally as bad unless you put something to support the poly. In other words, when the wind is moving and you have a piece of poly to a piece of poly taped, eventually the wind is going to pull out open, and the dust that goes through, or just the air across the adhesive, will dry it out. Pretty soon you don't have anything sealing it at all. So a lot of failures occur after the 1 year mark, sometimes into the 2 or 3 year mark. And the question is why? Well, because the tape came apart or the acoustical came apart. The acoustical acts as a gasket. So if you think of a gasket, if you put the heads on the engine on with a gasket and you don't put the bolts through, the gasket is useless. So the drywall on one side and backing on the other compresses and holds it in place. So that's important to understand as well. So the building code didn't require backing on poly until the energy code. Well, that's actually not true. So we hear that a lot in here in terms of the argument that, yeah, we just tape the joints or we just acoustical plus we tape them. But if you go back to 925, what does it say? It says that the joints have to be sealed and there has to be support for them. So the new building code says you have to put backing in there, but the original 925 says it had to be able to withstand the pressure that could be created by air pressure differentials. So it's always been in the code all the way back to 1997. We just haven't enforced it in the code. And then the third fallacy here is we need more ventilation. So the amount of times that people get a roofer involved because they have attic rain and the roofer goes out and puts vents on, or worse yet, he puts a whirlybird on. And as the wind blows across the top of that roof, the whirlybird gets going and it creates a suction. And now we've got more frost in the attic than we had before. There's the odd time where it'll reduce it. And what happens is that if you have lots of ventilation and the frost melts and drips down, depending on your insulation and what storage capacity it has, sometimes it'll just drip down into that insulation and be held in suspense there as the ventilation occurs when it's warmer. But in a lot of cases, that's not going to help you adding more ventilation. So those are some fallacies that we want to look at and rule out because we need to fix those. I always reference this quote, building code is the worst construction you can't go to prison for. Maybe you've heard that one. Joe Stebrook, John Straub, both of them talk about that. So when we look at the code itself, prescriptively, the code is flawed. The code tells you to do one thing in one area, and then in another area, it tells you to do a different thing. Or it asks you to do something that doesn't make sense. For instance, the code doesn't address frost, deposition. It talks about condensation, which in terms of evaporation is much different than frost. So there's a big difference in how that works. So I like to use the term, the prescriptive building code is the worst construction you can't go to prison for, because the objectives of the code work well. We don't want to have too much moisture. We don't want to have deterioration. We don't want to have mold. We don't want to create health issues for a customer. But the way it goes about trying to prescriptively tell you how to build is flawed. So when we understand the principles of why things happen, we can build in line with the building code and we can have a better performing structure or building. Let's look at it this way. Here we've got a dew point being reached. So here I've got 0 degrees in the attic, 21 degrees in the house. And then over here, because I have higher insulation values, I've got -12 in the attic. So if we go back and look at the amount of moisture in the air, so when it goes into the air, because it's warmer, which attic can hold more moisture? So the potential, because this is a warmer attic, is that the percentage or the relative percentage of humidity is lower on this side than it is on the right side. Outside yet, the air is pretty wet, like it's 85% relative humidity. So if that air were to go through the attic, how much moisture would it absorb? It's already almost full. So that's another reason why ventilation doesn't work, because when it's cold in the wintertime, the air, although it's really dry, small amounts of humidity, relative to the temperature, it's also really full of moisture. So if it's full of moisture and you send it through the attic, how do you get it to dry? Well, in this case, because you only have R20, that air coming into the attic will warm up and it's got a very low amount of percentage of moisture. Whereas if that air goes through this attic, it's really full. So that's another reason for that issue. The other thing to think about is when you have a cool outdoor temperature and at night it's clear sky, then the temperature is going to drop. So here we've got -15, it's 85%. If overnight we have no clouds and we drop to lower than -17, because that's the dew point for this air, any material that's lower than -17 is going to frost, and you're going to have that accumulation of frost. So you're going to get this deposition of frost inside, even though you haven't reached the dew point on the temperature. So it sounds fairly complex. I wouldn't worry about it too much. Just the fact to know that when you look at this, the colder it gets, the more risk for frost. A clear sky, you have the radiant cooling because heat moves to cold. Heat's moving to outer space and it's sucking the air out. That's how you can get frost, or sucking the temperature or the energy out. That's how you can get frost on a windshield when it's 3 degrees outside or 4 degrees outside. So if you come out in the morning and it's 3 or 4 degrees, it's the ambient air temperature is warm and you have frost in your window, it's because the radiant cooling of the sky, the clear sky, has actually pulled all the energy out and dropped the temperature of the windshield below 0. So those are factors that need to be understood from a standpoint of why do I get frost in my attic? So that's another thing to think about. Now, the converse or the opposite is effective as well. So in terms of sublimation, which one has better chance of absorbing moisture? So at 67% relative humidity, it's not super dry air, but it's not saturated air. So it still has some chance to absorb the moisture that's in that attic. So if you took the temperature -30, -35, and then you slowly warmed it up over a period of a week and a half, 2 weeks, the moisture that's in there in the form of frost would just sublimate. It would never melt. So you can gradually get rid of it. So it gradually built up, you can gradually get rid of it. So the idea is, if it's the natural environment that's creating the frost, it'll naturally go away. If you've accelerated that by not having a moisture balance, in other words, you're letting more air with humidity leak into the attic and accumulate big accumulations of frost, then the chances of you being able to sublimate all that and get rid of it safely without it turning to a liquid get lower and lower and lower, especially if we get the spikes in temperature. So it's important that we take into consideration the other two factors here. So we're going to talk about the openings and the pressure. So we talked about mop. We've talked about the moisture aspect, which is probably the most difficult to understand at this point. But that's one of the conditions for attic rain. So the amount of moisture that goes into the attic is directly related to how much moisture is in the house. But then now we need to look at the openings and pressure. So look at the openings when it comes to a building. Now, if we look back at history in the prairies, this was the average air tightness up until about the year 2000. So the average air tightness. So you had lots of houses that were really high, some were a lot lower, but the average air tightness was about 4.7 ACH. So that's air changes per hour, measured at a -50 Pascal pressure, which is the equivalent to having an equalized pressure on all 6 sides of the building of 32 km/h wind. So you know what it's like when you're standing outside and get a 30 km/h wind. There's a fairly strong pressure. So that's the pressure difference between the inside and the outside of the building envelope. So if you measured that and you were looking at air changes per hour, the air changes on this particular building at 30,000 cubic feet, which is basically a 2,500 square foot 2-story. So 2,500 square foot 2-story, so 30 by 40 2-story house. It's got about 30,000 cubic feet of area, or volume, not area. So the volume in that house is about 30,000. If I multiply that by 4.7, I get an air leakage rate per hour of 141,000 cubic feet of air leakage when I have a wind. If I divide that by 60, I get the CFM rating, or the cubic feet per minute, of about 2,350. Can you think of why you couldn't keep humidity in an old house? You remember the giant humidifiers that you used to have? You couldn't keep humidity in the house because there was so much air leakage. There was constantly air flowing between inside and outside. So we had to put a humidifier in, sometimes 2 or 3 humidifiers. It was just bone dry. Now we go into code design and we're saying, well, somewhere between 2.5 and 3.2 ACH. Well, now we've dropped that in half. So now we've got 75,000 cubic feet of leakage every hour, or 1,250 every minute. Drop that down again to 1.5, and we've dropped it a half again down to 750 CFM per minute. So now we're getting a reasonably airtight building. We've reduced the amount of airflow. We just don't know if that is all right here or if it's all right here. We just know the overall average is really, really tight. The average is really, really tight, meaning we don't have a lot of air leakage overall. So it's an energy rating, and it tells us how much energy we have to replace when we lose it through to leaking of this humid air from the building. Now, when we take that and we apply it to a passive house and say, okay, how tight is a passive house? Well, if we use the same exact footprint, same height, same volume, 30,000 cubic feet of air, then we apply the 0.6 ACH, we still have a leaky building. Relatively speaking, 18,000 cubic feet will leak out of that in a 32 km/h wind, which equates to 300 CFM every minute. So even on a super tight passive house, we can have these air leakage pockets where if we take the opening and we apply a pressure to it and we have moisture in that, we can have failures in a passive house. So a net zero house, a passive house can have failures, can have attic rain problems or moisture in the walls because of these factors. So airtightness is important, but it's not the overall most effective way to deal with it. We have to look at all aspects of airtightness. So let's look at this one here on the left. In this video, you can see the typical staining that you're going to see in an attic. There's the lines that you can see, the drip lines dripping from the ceiling. And that light, fluffy insulation, it won't hold any moisture. So it goes straight through and lands on the poly. And these roofs, because of the attic, they're just saturated, they're just full of moisture. Those airtight boxes or airtight pot lights are not anywhere close to airtight. Not even close. So if you put 1 or 2 in, it's probably fine. But if you put 20 or 25, you're going to have potential for lots of air leakage in there. If we look at this one really illustrates the use of poly. We talk of poly and acoustical sealant. There's the gasket aspect of it. This is a house that was done before the energy code. The argument was, well, it didn't require a backing on the poly hat. So look at the acoustical here. It's still flexible, it's still soft, but it's a gasket. So it's not an adhesive. So if you don't have a backing on there and the poly moves up and down every time the wind blows, pretty soon that's going to separate and you've got a wide open opening from the outside to the inside, or from the inside first, worse than that, the inside, it goes right up into the attic. So that's the challenge that we have with trying to make things airtight. This example here, when we look at this example on the ceiling here, the question comes up, is spray foam airtight? So we're talking about spray foam. This is an attic that was done with spray foam. So it should be reasonably airtight. But when we measure the volume, so we took the pot light out, it's an airtight pot light. And when we measure the volume of airflow, we've got the house at a -50 Pascal, 32 km/h wind. That ceiling with the spray foam has 38 CFM of leakage. So multiply that by 60 and it tells you how much leakage every hour. So that's one of the reasons why a spray foam attic will not perform any better than a regular attic if you have a pressure associated with it. So yes, it's great to be airtight for energy efficiency, but the airtightness has to be very, very consistent over the whole building. In other words, you could have a super airtight house with a few localized holes that are this big, and it could create problems for you. So my recommendation is when you're doing spray foam installations, do a blower door pre-drywall and test them. Make sure that you have the airtightness that you think that you have. Here's another example. This is a spray foam house. The water was dripping in through the attic, through the ceiling. And once we opened it up, you could actually see where it was coming from. So, you know, the joist hangers where the joists connect to the beam, those spots didn't get the spray foam filled right in. So if you know the difference between a closed cell foam and an open cell foam, closed to moisture, open to moisture, you could say a closed cell is a 2-pound foam and an open cell is a 1/2-pound foam. What happens is when you spray an open cell foam, it expands and it fills all the voids. So it works really good for air tightness. Closed cell foams, unless you get the gun right in and spray right at a surface, there's not much expansion. And if you spray over an area, it'll fill in so fast that you'll have tons of little voids in there. And that's what creates the problem. So understanding that as a builder means that you're going to leave them enough space to get a gun in there that's about 16 inches to get up inside there to spray it. You know, if you're assuming that the spray foam will go anywhere and everywhere and fill every void, then you're under the wrong assumption, because it doesn't. And we see tons of failures because of that, because of the inadequacy of the actual construction prior to. So if we go back to the building code and we talk about what it says in terms of, you know, taking responsibility for this, it says in there in 925.3, it says that the interior, we need to prevent excessive moisture and condensation in the spaces in the winter. So that red line on the inside, that's your air barrier. We don't care about vapor barrier. We care about air barrier. Vapor barrier doesn't have to be sealed. The confusion is when you put poly in, it acts as both air and vapor barrier. But in reality, the air barrier is 100 times more important than the vapor barrier. Way, way more important. So we want to make sure the air barrier is nice and tight, and the air barrier can resist the pressures that go along with it. So if you were crawling in an attic and you had a look at this attic, and you see how nice and clean it is over in these areas, and then you see this big accumulation of frost here, what was the assumption be? Well, you probably have a hole down here somewhere where the warm air is coming out, and then it's just freezing to the surface. And then the air continues up and out the vent, gone, but it's dumped all of the frost on the surface. The ventilation is not going to help you here, because you have a hole somewhere here that's being fed by a pressure, which is carrying the humidity from the house into the attic. So you need that air barrier to be nice and tight. In fact, the building code in the appendix gives you this statement: majority of moisture problems resulting from condensation in the walls in the attic. And this should say frost, because in the prairies, that's what we get is frost, not condensation. It says the majority of that is caused by air leakage into the attic. Air leakage must be controlled, and it must be rare. It must be small amounts. It must dry rapidly. And that's our responsibility. So that's why it's important to understand this and take responsibility for it. So when you walk into a building and you're looking at the poly installation before the drywall goes in, and you see these kind of things where they've put a bead of acoustical and then they've taped it, or they put a bead of acoustical no tape, or the joints are not supported, you know that in a matter of a year or two, these are going to be wide open and the air is going to freely flow into that attic. So that's where we need to make sure that we have support for the poly, especially the lighter the insulation that goes in the attic. If you're using the cellulose, if you're using bats, you probably find you'd have less of an issue, because the bat itself is going to push back against the drywall to support that poly. And when the wind blows, it's heavy enough to support the poly. But that light, fluffy stuff, it's got no weight to it whatsoever. The second part of that is when you do get frost and it drips down into the insulation, a fiberglass bat can absorb a lot of moisture before it ever reaches the poly. Same with cellulose. Whereas the fluffy insulation, it just goes right through it onto the poly and then drips out these openings. So it lets air in it lets water out. So when you look at some of these connections where we see failures, and we probably look at 300, 400 homes a year. So when we go into these houses and we're seeing the problems, here's where the problems come in. No connection at the poly where there's solid backing, something to hold that in place. And so it's just wide open and the air can just move freely through. So the more penetrations in the attic, the more pot lights in the attic, the more fans in the attic, the more challenges we have. What about bulkheads? If you're looking at this slide, you see a bulkhead here. And this is between a room. So it's an archway kind of built up above, but there's zero backing in here, right? So, and they've put a few staples along the edge. The acoustical is a little bit there, a little bit there, a little bit there, but there's all sorts of holes all the way around here where it's massive amounts of air leaking through there. So when it comes to these locations, why not just put a piece of OSB on there? OSB is qualified as a vapor barrier. So if you put a piece of OSB there and then caulk it, you've got a reasonably good air tightness versus trying to get a piece of poly to stay there. So using solid lumber and materials that protect are so important. You know, when you look at this video here and you look at the pot light here on the left, you know, there's nothing holding that. And the caulking there, it's still flexible, but it's not an adhesive. It doesn't stay stuck. So unless you have this backing behind it, unless you put a block across perpendicular on the trusses, you're always going to have the risk of that opening up and letting air blow through there. So you can have a tremendous amount of air blowing into the attic for those very reasons. And the solution, just air seal it. Put a block back on, reseal it, recaulk it, and put a block in to hold it in place. How about double walls? This is from the attic side looking down in between. How often would this happen? This is the demising wall and a party wall. How often would this happen? If you're trying to get down to a fairly reasonable air tightness in a building and you do a multifamily, these areas are just simple when you're framing. You know, if you have your wall here and you put a top plate on and you have your second wall here, 1 inch space in between, you put your top plate on. If you run a piece of poly on there and put your second top plate on, now you have a continuous air barrier all the way along that whole joint. And you don't end up with this, you don't end up with this, because how are you going to seal that now? You're asking the insulator to put those two pieces of poly together, somehow get a caulking or a tape on it, and provide backing behind it. It's almost impossible. So if you want to improve your air tightness, want to reduce the risk of air in the attic, then make sure that these walls, close walls together, have one continuous piece of poly across, or you could sheet the top of that too afterwards. You could just put some OSB on top of that and sheet it. Make sure you nail it really good. You can add caulking if you want to. Parallel walls, pretty simple. When they're offset, just a little bit bigger piece of poly. So sometimes you'll have townhouses in a row and one is offset. They're stepped all the way down. You just offset the poly, run it right through the whole top plate. Because if you try and tape that or seal it, it's going to fail. So you need some other way to stop the air movement through the assembly and prevent that from going into the attic. Lots of times when we crawl up in an attic, the issue becomes really obvious because if you get there when it's really cold, and this is my suggestion, is that if you're building houses and you have this issue with attic rain, that you go into the attic when it's really cold. First year of occupancy. Just show up with a ladder, pop the attic lid when it's really cold, have a look around. Ah, there's frost over there. Move the insulation out of the way. This is likely what you're going to find. There's an opening there somewhere. And that's the easiest way to diagnose it and fix it. If you do it after the fact, we're looking for air leaks, we're looking for where the air is moving. We can do that with a blower door and the infrared camera or a smoke pencil, but it's way easier when it's cold to identify it right away at the beginning. So before you put the board on, pre-drywall works really good. Or just walking around and looking at things. Like if you look at this installation here, there's a bath fan. You know, when you look closely at the connections of the poly, what do you see? So it's a matter of when you go through, visually looking for joints and connections that can create problems. So talking to the roughing trades, talking to the electrician, not taking a knife and putting a big slash to run a tiny wire through it, making sure the heating contractors understand what needs to be done. So it's an effort that will pay off in the long run. So here you see, we just had massive amounts of problems with bath fans and air leakage. So if you're using an HRV in a duct, that's great. If you're putting the fan in the wall instead of in the ceiling, that's great. There's lots of ways around this. So just to be aware of it. So the two areas, is where penetrations go through the electrical wire and the ductwork. That's one area. The other one is make sure that you have perpendicular blocking between the trusses to make sure that you have a good seal there. So those are two important areas to make sure that you don't have problems. I like this method here. I get the heating contractors to tell them, with the poly hat, just place it over that round duct, trace a line, and cut a star into it, and then stretch it over top of the mechanical, over top of that metal duct. And that'll give you a reasonably good airtight box. Same thing with your electrical. If you poke a hole through with a screwdriver, run the wire through reasonably tight, because the poly is not going to hold an adhesive very well or a caulking very well. And so that's why that would be my recommendation. The other one is the size of the poly hat. So a lot of times when we go into buildings, we find that the electrician got a deal on the poly hat. So he's using a 16-inch poly hat for 24-inch trusses. So you can see in the video here, the poly hat, first of all, was turned sideways. But when they put the rails on, they cut giant holes through it. You'd be better off to put the rails on, put the poly around the rails, or put the poly up on the sides, and then put the rails on so you're not cutting holes. But using the appropriate size would be important. So these are all physical examples of things that we've investigated over the last, I would say, 10 years of things that we've torn apart and looked at. Let me get this to move. So there's another example there. Right? Giant holes where the rails go through because they used the 16-inch poly hat or the 12-inch poly hat because they were cheaper, and not realizing that cutting those holes, you can't just send the insulator up there to try and tape those. That's not going to work. So my recommendation is pull that out and redo it. Have them redo it. They'll only do it once. Pot lights. Some of these pot lights don't require a poly hat around them, but they do require sealant here, especially when they're sitting in the middle of the truss. So if you put a rail across with a pot light, and then the rail is a little bit loose, the foam gasket around the pot light will never make tight contact with the drywall. So if you put a bead of caulking around it, at least you have half a chance of that making contact with the drywall, because otherwise there's no connection there. And eventually you're going to get a lot of air movement through into the attic. So pot lights, bathroom fans, there's that caulking around the gasket. If it's nice and tight to the truss, it's probably not an issue. But if it's not, if it's over towards the middle, if the box is over here, then definitely I would suggest putting a bead of acoustical around there. Same thing with electrical. The electrical boxes, they're airtight, except if you peel a big chunk of the foam off. But even in these locations, if that box is not sitting flat to the drywall, if it's offset a little bit, you can get a tremendous amount of air leaking through those. So it's all about the accumulated amount of air that goes in there, which dictates if the opening is too big or too small. So that's a factor to keep in mind. So I always just walk around with a flashlight, have a look, how big's the hole, how big's the opening, have a look. Generally, if you can keep your openings in your attic to less than 6 inches square, you're probably not going to have any attic rain. That seems to be the magic number. If you keep them all small and less than an accumulated amount of 6 inches, typically there's not enough air movement to create a problem. So cutting a square hole for a round pipe, right? And then using an acoustical to seal that. Acoustical is not going to seal that. In fact, a lot of times if it gets warm in there, it's just going to drip back out. So if you're installing it in the summertime, before you get the insulation in there, likely it'll be all dripped out and you'll have this giant hole on the four corners where those dryer vents go through the attic. This one kind of illustrates it for you. These guys used an acoustical to seal up around the pipe. This was during the pre-drywall review. They only got half the pipe sealed, but in the areas where they put a lot of it, like there's a hole right there because once it got warm, it just dripped out and rolled right down the wire onto the floor. Another reason why there needs to be a different material. Acoustical is designed to be compressed. It's not an adhesive, so it's designed to be compressed between materials to create a gasket. So those are factors that can contribute to better air tightness. Bathroom exhausts. When bathroom exhausts leak air into the attic, look what happens. You've got a tremendous amount of air there, and if there's a wind outside, the fan is trying to blow the air out, the wind is trying to blow the air in, and there's an opening in the duct, it's just going to leak into the attic. And you can see by the condition of the OSB that that's been happening for a while. So there is a code requirement in 9.32 that says that you have to seal the ducts and prevent the air from leaking into the attic. So this design, I don't know if that's typical in your area, but that design typically fails. So we're looking for either this, where we're using a mastic and we're sealing it, or even better, a lot of the new vents have these little collars on them that you can connect your ductwork to so that it's not going to leak into the attic. So that'll reduce the problem as well. Exhaust leakage is another one. We go up into an attic and we see how poorly the duct was sealed. You can see in here that there's a duct down there, and then as we move around, you'll see that there's more ducts in there, and there's where the accumulations primarily are. Because the accumulations are primarily occurring where the sealant is missing. So there's a classic example. Right, so the attic rain in this situation was caused a lot by having unsealed ductwork in the attic. So the bathrooms, you have high humidity, the bathrooms are dumping that out, there's a wind outside, it can't go out, can't go in, so it just leaks into the attic and you get this big buildup of frost. So it just gives us an example of some of the things that we can learn from when we're looking at attic spaces. Connections between the poly and the spray foam. Like this needs to have a piece of blocking here, like a 2x4, so that you can run a bead of caulking. So when the poly hits there, it's sealed tightly. And then the spray foam can be sprayed up to the blocking. You can't attach poly to spray foam and expect it to connect and provide a good air barrier. So having good backing is pretty important. Access. Here's the rough opening of the attic access, never been air sealed. So the trim on the outside edge is letting all the air go through. Even though you put the foam gasket inside here, the air is leaking out at the trim where the trim meets the finished drywall ceiling. And so spray foaming this or caulking this space will eliminate the air leakage at that location. So here's that one bit of right here, right? Because there's where the lid sits on top of the foam gasket. We just don't want the air to be coming out through the trim here or going back up underneath, creating problems with the attic access. So electrical boxes on the ceilings, on and on and on. So responsibility for compliance, we talked about that, but this is the point here that we want to really focus on: air barrier systems for control of condensation and in particular frost. It's far more important to have a good sealed air barrier than it is to have a vapor barrier. So no matter what you put as that protection on the inside, it's got to be sealed and it's got to be airtight and it's got to resist the pressures that the mechanical systems or other items within the building create. So for instance here, the building code 925.3 goes on to say it has to prevent excessive moisture condensation. You see that word there, excessive? It doesn't say we can't have any frost in the attic, can't have any frost in the concrete or in the walls, because typically that'll sublimate and go away. We don't get the liquid form from it. but we don't want that to accumulate and build up. So that's the trick. Okay, so now we've talked about the moisture. We've talked about openings or penetrations into the space. But now let's talk about the pressure, because this seems to be one of the key components at reducing attic rain, is the pressure. Think of the pressure of those ducts that we looked at. So you have a duct that's going up to the roof. You've got screws into a metal pan or a plastic coroplast, but they're not tight. So when the duct is pushing air out and the fan, is pushing the air and there's a wind on the other side, it just leaks in there because you've got too much pressure to stay in the pipe and it wants to leave the pipe. So it leaks into the attic. Well, the same principle applies on the building itself to stop the air from moving into the attic. So what changed in 2005? 2005 was kind of the year that we started to see more and more sealed combustion furnaces. So what's the difference? Well, a B-vented furnace, if we measured the pressures on a B-vented furnace, the average B-vented furnace runs at a slight negative pressure. So we've tested hundreds of these, and the average is about -3 pascals. So the furnace, this one here, runs at a slightly lower pressure, negative pressure. These ones, because we don't have the chimney or the B-vent moving out, but originally we had a pipe coming into the return side of the system that was undampered. These systems, when they first came out, until the new energy code came in, were running at approximately 3 pascals positive. So -3 to 3 pascals is a 6 pascal change, which is a reasonably high pressure difference. So if all you did was take your old house and went from a B-vented furnace that was taking air out, creating a suction, to a high efficiency furnace, you could create moisture problems in your house. And the reason is because when you take air out through the chimney, it creates a suction of dry air back into the building. And the dry air coming back into the building actually creates a dryer effect. Now, what's a 6 pascal pressure? Well, watch what happens when the furnace kicks in this video. So this is a polyed house, pre-drywall. Fire up the furnace, kick it on. That's approximately 5 pascals, if I remember, that's what we tested. So the poly, or the seal, according to the building code, 925.3, this is what it says. Air barriers shall possess the characteristics necessary to provide an effective barrier to an air infiltration and exfiltration. Here's the point. Under a differential pressure due to stack, mechanical systems, or wind. So if you have a hole in that poly and there's a pressure of 5 PA, there's a constant airflow into the attic. And if there's a constant airflow and you have humidity in that house going into the attic, it's -30 in the attic, and you have all that energy. Remember the requirement for energy, 1,000 BTUs to evaporate a pound of water. So if you're looking at why we're getting moisture in the attics, a big part of it is the change in mechanical systems, which created the pressure, which pushed air into the attics, even in small amounts and small openings. So let's compare that to a commercial building. Don't commercial buildings pressurize the buildings? Absolutely. When you go to a store and you open the front doors, the wind blows out at you. And the reason being is that you don't want the person standing 5 feet within the store to be freezing cold every time the door opens. So you pressurize a commercial building to push air out, except for hospitals and swimming pools. Why? Because we know if we pressurize those, we push air into the cavities and into the walls, and we create problems. So wherever we have high humidity, we tend to create a negative pressure that those run under. But the other thing about these commercial buildings is that the average humidity is low, equal to or less than 20%. It's really dry in a commercial building. So the air is moving 24/7, and the air is really, really dry. So yes, it's under a positive pressure, but the flow is huge. So if you take a new house and it's running at a 35% relative humidity as opposed to 20%, that's a significant amount more moisture in the air. This is a passive house that's built north of us, and the homeowner was complaining about the front door freezing shut every time it got cold. Well, they were operating at 35% relative humidity, which I think is a normal number, but they had a really high positive pressure. They hadn't balanced the HRV. So when the air blew, it blew past the weather stripping and out and created the frost. In fact, there's so much airflow. Look at how much airflow there is there. The frost wasn't even forming at the edge. It was forming an inch away from the surface. So you can see the lines down here of the frost and how it would blow out. And on the surface that has continual airflow, there's no frost accumulation. It's only when it slows down and becomes stagnant that you start to get the frost accumulation. So in this case, we're working on the assumption that it's a high pressure, not an overly high humidity level. Maybe if it's minus 30, I might probably want to lower that to 30, but the building code says I can have it at 35%. So for warranty purposes, they're still within tolerance. So when we're talking about balancing the pressure, combustion furnaces run at a slightly positive pressure, depending on what the return air or fresh air intake, not the return air, the fresh air intake is doing. So if you have a fresh air intake and it's on a motorized damper that only opens when the furnace is running, does it connect to something that removes air and exhausts at the same time? Because if it doesn't, if it's only bringing air in and not exhausting air, then you're creating a positive pressure. So for the first, I don't know how many years, 2005 up until about 2016, 2017, we saw a tremendous amount of attic rain. And a lot of it was pressure related. Now we're seeing installations of systems that don't have balanced HRVs, and they're creating the same problems. Or they're setting them in at a positive pressure of just 10%, because when you put that in, your exhaust and your intake have to be balanced within 10%. So if you balance that to be a positive pressure of 10%, and you're dealing with, let's say you're dealing with 100 CFM, well, you might be bringing in 110 and only exhausting 100. Well, now you're pressurizing the building. You can go that percentage the other way, and you could exhaust 110 and bring in 100, and you'd be within code, but you're now running at a negative pressure. So the bigger the unit, the bigger the building, the more pressure you expect to achieve when you do that. So that's why looking at this is so important from that perspective. So when we're looking at that, you know, in an old house, if we had a 65 CFM in and out, but we had a B-vented furnace, we're creating a negative pressure on an old house and a positive pressure on a new house, right? Because in this case, that chimney is creating an out pressure. In this case, we have a fresh air intake, bringing it in undampered. We don't have an exhaust, so we're pressurizing the building. So that's some of the reasons why. So if you're working with an older house or a renovation, or you're dealing with a building that has a primary exhaust fan, whether it's an inline fan or a bathroom fan, and you have a manual switch on the wall for the principal ventilation, if you don't run that switch, I tend to call this an anti-attic rain switch. And the reason is because when you flip that switch on, it turns the fan on either inline or in the bathroom, and it turns the furnace on because it's interlocked. So then it brings in, for instance, 65, and it removes close to 65, right? It might only remove 62, might remove 68, doesn't matter, within 10%. But that's the difference in terms of the pressurization. And that's why it's important when we look at this to make sure that if you have this older system without an HRV, that when you have the furnace running, this gets flicked on and it runs at the same time, because that's what's going to reduce the pressure in the building. It's the equal air going in and out, right? If we got 65 going in, we want 65 coming out. We want a balanced system. And if we have a slightly unsealed air barrier, let's say it's an older house and you're doing some upgrades, The worst thing you could do is upgrade that and not balance the system and create a positive pressure, because that's going to push air out into the walls in the attic. So an older house, you can take it from actually performing reasonably well to having a disaster if you don't balance that mechanical system. So important to understand that. So with an HRV, same principle. You know, the system needs to be balanced. You have a little fan motor here, and you have a little fan motor here. So for a simple system, you might be able to have that fan pull air in, dump it into the return, and then pull air out, or vice versa, pull it out of the return. And in this way, as long as you've got the same amount, 60 going in, 60 going out, you've got a balanced system. But the unit itself is not going to balance it. You have to physically balance that HRV to make sure you have the same amount of air going in as going out. And that's going to help reduce the problem with overpressurization. So you might have this damper system. These are ports for putting your manometer in so you can measure the pressure differential. These are the ports or the flaps that can adjust. Some of them are self-adjusting. Some of them need to be adjusted. Some of them have a little motor switch where you push the motor and you increase the exhaust or the intake so that it balances the amount of airflow coming in or going out. So you just have to look at the manual and see how that HRV needs to be balanced. But I would always balance it on the side of negative pressure in the house, just a small negative pressure. Now, one word of caution. If you have a fireplace, wood burning that's unsealed, or you have any unsealed appliances, then this does not apply. You need to have sealed combustion appliances for this to apply. So you want to be less than 5 PA or less than 5 pascals differential, just to avoid depressurization and backdrafting of things coming back into the house. So take a little more caution if you have any unsealed appliances like fireplaces or hot water tanks, things like that, because that can create some issues with carbon monoxide. But things like this, like when you see a balancing sheet, right, on high speed, they balance this one. So they've got fresh air coming in at 176, exhaust 162. So they're pressurizing the house. Same thing on their low speed or continuous speeds. They're pressurizing the house. So it meets the building code. But if your air barrier isn't super tight, it's potential to have problems. So that's the difference. Also room by room pressurization. This particular house had a really high pressure. Like it was so high that out of these ducts, there was no dampers on the ducts, but it was so high that the floor grate or the grill was vibrating when it was in the floor. But when we measured some of the other ones around the house, we found that there was overpressurization in individual rooms. So that particular room has a 6 pascal pressure in it. So when you close the bedroom door and you're operating the furnace, that particular room is overpressurized. So now if you have an unbalanced HRV and you're bringing more air in than you're exhausting, maybe you have a 5 pascal pressure in the house already, then in the return air in here, it's not pulling enough air back, so you're overpressurizing the room. That room might have a 12 pascal pressure, and if it's the top of a 2.5-story house, you might have a stack pressure as well. So you have a really, really good air barrier up there, but you have way too much pressure in that room. And that can be contributing to why you're getting a condensation problem, a frost problem, a stain in the ceiling or a stain in the walls, because you're way overpressurizing that particular room. So it's not just the balance of the HRV inside to outside, it's also the balance room by room when we're talking about supply and return. Undercutting the door, putting a transfer grill, something to let the air pressure out when the door is closed will really, really help. This is another one that we find is quite common, is pressurization from main floor to basement. So look at the blower door fabric there, it's blowing out. So the furnace is running, I close the door to the basement, and watch what happens to the fabric here. We've created a pressure on the main floor of the house. The reason being, we're not getting enough return air down to the basement, so we have to build up this big stack pressure to force the air back down to the return airs. So we're over pressurizing the main floor of the house because we don't have enough return airs, and it's pressurizing the whole upstairs, not just the main floor, but the second floor as well. So the basement's at a lower pressure than the main floor and the upstairs. So that's another factor that comes in. So you can see that pressurization or mechanical systems become very, very critical when it comes to controlling the air. If you want to understand stack pressure, here's a great way to look at it. See how the air is trying to get sucked in at the bottom of this tarp? Somewhere in the middle, we have a neutral plane, and then at the top, it's trying to push out. So we call that exfiltration at the top, infiltration at the bottom, and neutral pressure plane at the middle. And the bigger the temperature difference between inside and outside is the bigger the pressure that it creates. So this is what we call stack pressure. So when warm air leaks into the bottom, or cold air leaks into the bottom, and then the warm air rises, it puts a tremendous pressure at the top of the building. You know, so if you're dealing with this type of a building where you've got a main floor, a second floor, and a third floor, then you can have a tremendous amount of pressure just from the natural stack pressure that occurs. So that's an important factor as well. This is one I always talk about, and I go back to my days as a framer and as a site superintendent, frustrated with trades who didn't do things the way I thought they should, but they didn't have any details on the blueprints to show them how to do it. The blueprints were 3 pages long. It left most to your imagination. It gave you the layout of the floor and the walls, but it didn't give you any details on how to put it together. So if you don't put the details on the plans, if you don't have a scope of work that identifies what needs to be done, that makes it a little more challenging too. So tell people, if you're putting a duct up through the attic, it can't leak into the attic. It's got to be on the blueprint. It reduces your liability. It reduces the risk, because you can go back to that trade and say, hey, you know, you didn't do it the way we asked you to do it. So those are some of the factors. We've talked about moisture. We've talked about the openings or the penetrations, and we've talked about the pressures. Those are the conditions required for attic rain to occur. MOP, MOP, moisture, opening, and a pressure. So to reduce the attic rain, to reduce the potential, then you want to have all three addressed. Going up into attics and having a look around, you know, visual reviews. This is about, I think this was -28 the day I went up in this attic. And just visually looking around, you can see that there's a big open space there at the bottom. There's lots of ventilation in this roof. You can see down right out through the soffits. But look at the amount of frost accumulation there. When you look around that whole attic, you can see exactly where the air was leaking out. There was a double wall in the bathroom that wasn't sealed on the top. And the air was leaking straight up because the rest of the attic was clean. It was just in this one double wall section. In fact, when I reached down into the insulation, there was big solid lumps of ice in there. So when we're doing diagnostics, we're trying to figure it out. Air tightness is important, but air tightness is for energy. So when we're looking for air tightness, we're looking for localized air leakage locations. We can do a mechanical balance, make sure that's done. We can do a zone pressure diagnostic. If we have somebody in the area that's got a blower door, we can do pressurization of the house, and we can test that against the pressures in the attic, the pressures in the walls, the pressures in units beside if we're dealing with multifamily. We can also use pressure pans, which is basically the manometer is connected to a flat pan, and you can place that over a pot light, or over a bathroom fan, or over an electrical outlet, and you can measure the pressure difference. So if the house is set at a -50 pressure, -50 pascals, because the blower door is running, you can take a pressure pan and you can measure how much leakage is occurring at those specific areas, and that'll tell you whether it's tight or whether it's not tight, and tell you what direction to go when you're looking at dealing with it. The other thing is with infrared, and what drives me crazy is people that use infrared with no pressure differential. So if you're just looking for missing insulation, an infrared camera will kind of point you in the right direction. But if you're looking for air leakages, you have to put the house under a pressure differential. So a blower door, either pressurizing to look at the outside or depressurizing to look at the inside. And that'll help you to determine how much air leakage, where the localized areas are, and where you have to go to seal it up. But best bet is if you can get in there during the first year and have a look at it, that'll make all the difference in the world. Data loggers. I use these all the time. It's a little data logger. It's about 90 bucks. You plug it into your computer, you set the parameters, how much you want it to record, how often. It'll record 16,000 points of data. So you can have it record the temperature and relative humidity every hour. So if you threw this into a new house and let it sit there for the first year of construction, you would know how the homeowner is operating. You would know if they're running their humidity too high. You would know what their temperatures are. You would know when these things were occurring. Is it only when they're home in the evening? You could tell when they went away on holidays in the wintertime, because it's recording all the information, the parameters of what the temperature and humidity is on a daily basis. But you don't even have to go to these. You can go to an Ecobee thermostat. Ecobee thermostats have a built-in data logger function. So they record all that information anyway. It's a little electronic one, looks like a Nest, and that'll help you to collect that data too. Because if you're like me, when you go to a homeowner's house and say, how often do you run the fans? That's all the time. Do you keep your humidity low? Oh, of course. So, you know, they probably don't pay attention to that until they have a problem. And then they realize, I have no idea, but I'm assuming I do. So this way you can keep track of it, and you can identify whether it's a building performance issue or whether it's an issue with the information that's coming from the homeowner. You know, tracking this data, keeping this data is important. You know, there's a pressure pan, we're measuring the pressure. This is a well-connected pot light, well-connected to the outside, because at -50, it's still at 30. So it's more connected to the outside than the inside. Double walls, here's what it looks like. Pressure differential because of the blower door, infrared camera, that's a shower. Look at the amount of air behind there. It's just freezing cold. We're getting tons of airflow in behind here. Here's a double wall, drop ceiling. Look at the connection there. Everywhere there's a bead of glue holding the drywall on, the air can't get past it, so it stops. Everywhere in between, the air is just blowing down. There must be some openings or penetrations over here. It's blowing down in between the studs and then following along in between the drywall wherever it can go. So lots of different ways. Garage common wall, attic access, at the trim. Nice and tight where the foam seal is, but the trim is leaking. Bulkhead connections, there's a bulkhead up there. Pot lights. So what's attic rain? Well, the moisture accumulates faster than you get rid of it. It's created because you have a moisture in the air, you have an opening where the air can move through, and you have a pressure to push the air through that opening. So it's the Mop Principle. You deal with the Mop Principle by dealing with the first source, which is the moisture. Keep it low, below 35%. Make sure your penetrations are small and consistent, and then make sure there's no pressure. It's pushing the air through. The taller the building, the more risk of stack. And with the mechanical systems, making sure your HRVs and your ventilation system are balanced. Air in equals air out. So, any questions?
Darrell, we do have one question from someone.
Okay.
What they've said is they built a fully insulated detached garage, and the homeowner did not heat the space during the winter. There's an excessive amount of interior frost buildup now on the garage door, on plugs, switches, and on the drywall screws, and in drywall corners of the garage. It's essentially a meat locker. How do they manage the frost of the interior of this garage, air exchange, or install a heater?
Either will work. So what's happening is that your garage is unheated, so the interior surfaces are freezing cold. So you bring your vehicle in the wintertime and it heats the garage. Well, warm air absorbs all the moisture. So now you have really humid air that's reasonably warm, and then overnight as the temperature falls in the garage, all those surfaces cool off again. And the first ones to cool off would be the trim around the attic lid, the windows, the doorknobs, the metal garage door. So once it gets to below freezing, now you start to get deposition or accumulations of frost on those units. So the way to get rid of that is either heat it so that it never gets that low a temperature, but even if you heat it, you still need to ventilate it. So better yet, just make sure you have a fan in there with a humidistat, and you set that at 40% or whatever number you want. But if you set it at 40%, as the car cools and the humidity goes up, the humidistat activates and takes the humid air out. And that'll get rid of that problem. That's a good question, because I see that quite often, actually. All right, excellent. Thank you very much. if anybody wants to look up the Instagram account here, I'm just going to plug myself. But we've got tons of videos and pictures and descriptions of everything that we've talked about here, as well as multiple others. And you'll find that useful in talking to trades, talking to homeowners, explaining things to people. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Darrell. And yes, make sure you please, oh, it looks like we do have a hand raised. Is there maybe a question that's in the chat?
Hi, thanks for having me. How would I get rid of the ice that's in the attic though? Like the big icicles at this point?
So this is the same garage, the question is previous?
No, sir. It's from a issue I've got right now with a customer.
Okay, so first thing, if you see the icicles in there, you want to dig the insulation out of the way, find out where they're coming from. So find the hole. It
Okay.
might be from an exhaust duct that is unsealed. It might be from a void in the ceiling somewhere, but find that first. You can break the icicles off, just put a bucket up there and just chuck them into the bucket.
Okay.
But other than that, yeah, you're looking to find, like, short term, as it warms up, short term, it's not going to hold that moisture very long. If it gets above zero, it's going to dry the attic out fairly quickly. You probably find it less than 4 or 5 days to be completely dried out again once it warms up. But if it's not warming up and you're in the attic, then I would want to fix the holes first, look at the pressurization, and then, maybe get rid of those chunks of frost by just chucking them in a bucket for the time being and taking them out.
May I ask one more?
Yeah, sure.
So what happens if I find like the vapor barrier has been broken? What's the best way to seal that back up?
Well, on your vapor barrier, like if you have an opening in the poly, right? Let's say you've got a poly hat. I'm not very good at drawing this by hand, but let's say you got a hole in the poly hat. So if you look from a side view, here's the hole, and you got a wire running through it, and you got air blowing through. If you put some spray foam in and you build a blob of spray foam in all the way up on this side, and then let it come out the other side, so it compresses the piece of poly into the spray foam, that'll work. If you just put it on one side, it'll just pop off the first time it moves. So you can create a pressure that way. If it's at the joint in the poly on the ceiling itself, or where the poly hat goes up and meets the ceiling, just reseal that with some acoustical and then stick a block back on and put a screw in each end of it.
Oh, fantastic.
That'll work too.
Oh, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Here's another question. Thoughts on unvented vaulted attics? I have no problem with unvented attics if they're done correctly. So it depends on what the insulation is in the unvented attic. So if we're talking an unvented attic, let's say we're talking a cathedral ceiling. I'm assuming this would be a cathedral ceiling. So, maybe we've got an I-joist that comes up on either side. The wall comes down here. If you're putting fiberglass in here, I would completely avoid that, unless you can get a really, really tight air seal down here. So that means don't run any electrical through there, don't run any plumbing, don't run any heating, nothing goes through there. This is 100% sealed. Then you put all your electrical on the surface of this. And then that way, basically you turn it into a cavity that there has no potential for air to get in there. The risk with that is, because it's not vented, you're going to create some issues in there. So typically spray foam is the better way to go. There is some designs on unvented attics using fiberglass, but they don't perform really well in cold climates. The other thing to consider too is if you put a little bit of insulation on the top, just enough to make sure that any air leakage that gets in there won't condense on the surface, you can reduce the risk there. And then I would put something like a Intello or Siga or the Certainteed Smart Vapor Barrier. I'd always put a smart vapor barrier on here, because then if there is any accumulations later on, it can dry out. But remember, there's two things to deal with here. One is the drying aspect, which is after the fact, which is what the smart vapor barrier takes care of. The other one is the amount of condensation or frost that can accumulate is directly related to the air that leaks into the cavity. So the purpose of venting in 9.19 of the building code, the purpose of venting is specifically to get rid of moisture accumulations related to air leakage into the attic space. So that's the purpose of venting. So it can be a fairly complex detail. The spray foam I like because you can go in and do a blower door test. You can verify that it's nice and airtight. Problem solved. Fiberglass, different situation. So hopefully that answers your question. You guys can always send me an email if you have a question. We do consulting work all across the province or prairies, I should say. So it's Darrell@qualistat.com. So if anybody wants some assistance or help with that, we can do the engineering for it or design for it.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Darrell. This has been a tremendous presentation. We've really enjoyed you sharing your knowledge with us. And thank you all for attending this afternoon session. We look forward to hosting you all again next month on March 24th for our next virtual session. And this one will be hosted by the CHBA and will be a cost-benefit analysis workshop on local energy efficiency partnerships, or LEAP. And this will be the first in a series of LEAP workshops that we'll be partnering with the CHBA on to provide to our members over the next 3 years. So, and we're also working on additional technical sessions for April and May. And so watch for details on these upcoming events. Once again, Darrell, thank you so much. Thank you to PHBI for once again hosting our technical session today. And to everyone, until we see you again, stay safe, take care, and we'll see you in March.